Richard drove along a 2-lane highway near Lafayette, Louisiana. Morning light shone on the windshield. Matthew sat beside him, observing thick cypress trees. Ella and Zoe rearranged backpacks in the back seat. The trunk held tents, sleeping bags, and canned food. They intended to explore a secluded cave and a nearby river for 4 days. Richard recalled visiting that area with his father long ago. Zoe expressed concern about unmarked trails and unknown wildlife. She asked if they had enough gear for navigation and safety. Matthew agreed with her. He pulled a folded road map from his jacket pocket and showed it to Richard. Richard briefly glanced at it and insisted that it was unnecessary because he knew the way. Matthew insisted they bring a compass, and Richard finally agreed, although his tone suggested reluctance. He wanted an undisturbed experience, free from electronic devices and constant reliance on guidebooks. He stressed that real adventure required trust in the wilderness. During the drive, the 4 friends engaged in playful banter. Ella teased Matthew about his caution, saying that he worried too much about muddy trails. Zoe occasionally laughed, but her nervous glances at the dense vegetation beyond the windows revealed her hesitation. Richard's excitement seemed unshakable, and he steered the conversation toward the cave's rumored beauty, describing a stretch of quiet water flowing past limestone walls. He said that this would be a trip none of them would forget. Matthew tried to explain that local legends described strange animal sightings in remote parts of the forest. But Richard interrupted with a dismissive remark, calling Matthew timid. Zoe sided with Matthew, saying that caution was wise in a region famous for hidden predators. Richard simply changed the subject and joked about the strengths of the group. Ella seemed more curious about the scenic wonders than worried about potential danger. She trusted Richard's memory and was thrilled at the chance to see wildlife, even if it meant stepping off the usual paths. They turned onto a gravel road that ran for several miles past scattered farmhouses and empty barns. A final turn brought them to a dirt lane. Trees formed a canopy, blocking most of the sunlight. They stopped at a makeshift parking area marked by a faded wooden sign. They stepped out and inhaled the humid air. A swamp lay to the west, thick forest to the east. They gathered their gear and locked the car. Phones stayed in the glove compartment. They intended to fully rely on each other. Richard hoisted a large backpack onto his shoulders. Matthew quickly counted water bottles and trail snacks. Zoe double-checked her boots. Ella shielded her eyes from the sun and marveled at the unfamiliar bird calls that echoed across the treetops. The group set off, stepping onto a barely visible footpath. Twisted roots jutted from the damp soil. The pungent smell of decaying leaves drifted around them. They moved at a moderate pace, carefully placing each step, occasionally pausing to watch small animals scurry under thick shrubs. After 1 mile, the trail vanished into a patch of dense undergrowth. Richard pointed toward a cluster of pines, certain that the correct route lay just beyond them. Zoe wanted to check the map, but Richard brushed aside the suggestion with a confident nod, saying he remembered a rocky outcrop that would appear soon. Matthew gave Zoe a concerned look, but followed Richard anyway. Ella remained enthusiastic, snapping pictures with a disposable camera she had brought. As they continued deeper, the atmosphere grew unsettling. The canopy thickened, preventing direct sunlight from touching the ground. The sound of dripping water intensified, and every rustle in the bushes drew their attention. Zoe started to regret leaving her phone in the car. She asked if anyone else felt uneasy, and Ella admitted that the forest's silence was more oppressive than she had expected. Richard told them to remain calm and promised that they would reach a beautiful clearing before dusk. An hour later, they found no clearing. They pressed on, but the sense of isolation increased with each step. By the time the sky began to darken, the group realized that the forest around them looked untouched by any trail maintenance or signage. Tension rose. Richard insisted everything was fine. Matthew looked uneasy. Zoe frowned at the looming shadows. Ella's earlier excitement shifted to caution. No one spoke. They decided to stop at a small open area just large enough for their tents, hoping to settle for the night without trouble. They sat on damp ground as darkness settled across the Louisiana forest. A small fire crackled at the center of their makeshift camp. Richard arranged a few large branches to keep the flame steady. Zoe removed a can of beans from her backpack and handed it to Matthew. Ella set out some protein bars near the fire, then brushed leaves off her jacket and whispered that the woods seemed too quiet. The distant hoot of an owl made her flinch. Matthew peeled back the lid of the can and stirred its contents with a pocket knife. His expression revealed discomfort. He occasionally glanced at Richard, who poked at the fire with a stick. Zoe folded her arms and tried to keep warm. She admitted that she was uneasy about their location. Richard spoke in a calm tone and reminded everyone that this was the kind of raw, outdoor experience they had hoped to find. He said there was no need to panic. Ella leaned closer to the fire and smiled at Richard, urging him to tell a frightening story. She said that it would liven up the mood. Richard tried to recall some eerie childhood tale, but before he could speak, Matthew stepped in. He volunteered his own version of a horror story he claimed to have heard from local fishermen. He described something that prowled among the cypress groves, waiting for unsuspecting travelers. He explained that some nights, people disappeared without a trace. Zoe's face grew tense. She stared at the shifting shadows around their campsite. Richard forced a laugh and joked that Matthew was exaggerating. Ella, however, looked intrigued. She watched Matthew with curiosity, seemingly drawn to his willingness to set a grim scene. Richard noticed the attention she gave Matthew and tightened his jaw. He told Matthew to stop scaring them with absurd nonsense. Matthew shrugged and gazed at Ella as if to say he had only been entertaining the group. Zoe muttered that the forest was unsettling enough without more frightening ideas. They finished their simple meal and leaned back against their packs. The night air felt heavy. Insects buzzed near the firelight, drifting in and out of view. Zoe zipped her jacket and said she wanted to keep the fire bright until morning. Richard nodded in agreement and suggested taking turns staying awake to watch the flames. Ella said it would be best to get some rest before that. She excused herself to set up her sleeping bag, but Richard stopped her. He cleared his throat and began narrating an old memory. He talked about family trips with his father, recalling that they had often camped by silent lakes in remote areas. He said he had always felt thrilled by the quiet, as if the world beyond the trees did not exist. Ella listened closely, and a small smile crossed her face. Matthew looked somewhat irritated that Richard had reclaimed the conversation. When Richard finished, Zoe asked Matthew to elaborate on the story about the mysterious creature lurking in these woods. She said it sounded too specific to be made up. Matthew shrugged, explaining that old fishermen loved to repeat urban legends. Richard rolled his eyes at the mention of legends. He insisted they had more immediate concerns, such as getting enough rest and continuing their trip in the morning. An hour later, they crawled into sleeping bags. The crackling fire cast flickering patterns on tree trunks. Zoe dozed fitfully, and Ella slept with her jacket pulled over her head. Richard remained awake, staring into the dark. He heard the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. His pulse quickened, but he hesitated to wake the others. He clutched the flashlight beside him and scanned the tree line. he saw nothing. The noise stopped and started again minutes later. When morning arrived, Matthew was the first to stir. He left his sleeping bag and wandered outside the perimeter of their small camp. He suddenly found prints in the mud. They looked bigger than ordinary wolf tracks, though he could not fully identify them. His breath caught in his throat. He quietly called Richard over and pointed at the pattern in the soft ground. Richard's expression changed. He mumbled that maybe it was a large stray dog or a coyote. Matthew did not look convinced. Zoe emerged from her sleeping bag, rubbing her eyes. She noticed Matthew and Richard kneeling by the prints. Ella joined them and peered at the tracks, saying they looked unnaturally large. The group gathered their gear with tense efficiency. Matthew suggested moving on quickly. Richard agreed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. They doused the remaining embers and started walking, aware that the forest might hold more than just eerie legends. The group moved through thick foliage, sensing a shift in the forest's atmosphere. The morning sun was muted by layers of moss-draped branches overhead. Richard led the way, but he appeared less certain of his direction than before. Matthew and Zoe exchanged worried glances. Ella trailed behind, occasionally kicking at roots that snagged her boots. Zoe tried to keep everyone focused on safety. She repeatedly asked Richard about the shortest route back to the car, but he claimed the map and compass were unnecessary because he remembered every twist in the terrain. Matthew's patience wore thin. He pointed out that nobody saw him actually pack a compass, and he accused Richard of being careless. Richard's cheeks reddened, and he admitted that he did not bring one. He said he thought his recollection would be enough. Zoe stared at the ground in disbelief, and Ella exhaled loudly, disappointed by Richard's oversight. They trudged onward, though the undergrowth and twisting game trails offered little certainty that they were moving in the right direction. Matthew demanded that they turn back immediately, reminding Richard about the strange tracks near their camp. Zoe joined in, saying the risk was too high without proper navigation tools. Richard refused, claiming that the cave and the nearby river were close if they just pressed forward a bit longer. Ella asked him if he was sure. He nodded, but his expression betrayed flickers of unease. Tension climbed. Zoe complained that her shoulders hurt. She said the pathless route was wearing her down. Ella tried to diffuse the situation, telling Zoe they could rest as soon as they reached a more open area. Matthew walked with his arms crossed, occasionally checking for any sign of a trail marker. They found none. The humidity weighed on them, and the constant drone of insects magnified their frustration. Midday arrived with no clear progress. Zoe insisted that Richard stop pretending everything was under control. Matthew supported her, saying that ignoring the problem could put them in danger. Richard snapped at both of them, urging them to trust his instincts. Ella stayed quiet, fiddling with the straps of her backpack. She wanted to see the cave, but was beginning to suspect they were lost. She noticed that none of the surroundings looked familiar to Richard. A few hours later, they reached a mossy clearing near a slow-moving creek. The water was shallow, and the bank was littered with rocks. Richard squatted by the edge, scooped up some water in his hands, and splashed it on his face. Zoe asked if he recognized this creek. He shook his head and said it might be an offshoot of the river he mentioned. Matthew stood nearby, arms tense, scanning the trees. Ella wondered aloud whether they should follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead them to a known area. As they debated, a distant sound broke the stillness, a sharp snapping of branches. They froze. Zoe looked around, gripping the straps of her pack. Matthew gestured for silence. Richard listened closely, trying to identify the noise. The sound repeated, echoing between tall trunks. It was impossible to pinpoint its source. Ella whispered that it might be an elk or a deer. Zoe said it did not sound like any deer she knew. Matthew recalled the unusual footprints they had seen that morning. His brow creased with concern. They decided to leave the creek and push farther south, hoping to intersect a ranger trail. Richard insisted that the official hiking routes were not far, but his confidence rang hollow. They stepped carefully over the uneven ground, leaving the mossy clearing behind. The sun hung low, illuminating columns of dust in the humid air. Zoe checked her watch, but it had stopped. She frowned, feeling more unsettled. As dusk approached, they found themselves in a dense cluster of pines. The sky overhead turned a muddy gray, and the forest floor darkened. Zoe and Matthew insisted they camp again. They had covered a lot of distance, yet the area remained unfamiliar. After some arguing, Richard conceded. He declared that they would build a large fire to keep any wild animals at bay. Nightfall crept over them like a silent threat. Zoe and Ella lit a circle of lanterns around their tents while Matthew gathered extra branches. Richard hovered nervously, glancing between the trees. An hour passed with no incident. Then, as they settled in, they heard a low growl from somewhere beyond the firelight. Their eyes locked in shared alarm, and they realized they had strayed far from any sense of security. Morning light brought little reassurance. Zoe woke to find strange marks on several nearby trees. They were long scrapes, positioned higher than a person could comfortably reach. She called Ella to look, and they both examined clumps of odd fur tangled in the bark. Ella suggested it belonged to a large wolf, but she said the color and texture seemed unusual. Zoe shuddered and insisted they show Matthew and Richard. Matthew emerged from his tent and walked over, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped short when he saw the scratches and the bits of fur. He ran a hand over the raw grooves in the wood, then glanced at the ground. He spotted footprints that were deep and erratic. Richard joined them, and his face tightened at the sight. He tried to sound calm, saying there were black bears in Louisiana, but Matthew pointed out that bears left different kinds of marks. Zoe noticed that Richard appeared more unsettled than he wanted to admit. They agreed to move quickly. Zoe demanded they head back the way they came, but Richard insisted they were too far along a different route. He argued that the cave must be close, and that a river ranger station should lie beyond it. He admitted that he was confused by the terrain, but he believed forging ahead was the best option. Tensions flared. Matthew confronted Richard about his faulty memory, and Richard snapped that he never promised perfection. Zoe nearly cried out in frustration, and Ella stepped between them. Ella tried to soothe everyone by reminding them that they were friends. She said that panic would make them lose track of rational decisions. She also wanted to see the cave, but the discovery of those unsettling scratches made her wary. She asked Richard if there was a definitive landmark they could watch for. He could not offer a clear answer. He muttered that they should keep an eye out for a ridge or any sign of limestone formations. They set off at a brisk pace, each person glancing over their shoulder. The forest seemed quieter than before. Even the insects sounded subdued. Matthew kept his hunting knife within easy reach. Zoe held a long stick for balance on slippery slopes. Ella focused on comforting Zoe whenever she gasped at rustling noises in the underbrush. Richard walked up front, but he checked behind him more often than he looked ahead. Shortly after midday, they reached a stretch of uneven ground where boulders jutted from the soil. Richard claimed it indicated they were near rock formations that might lead to the cave. Matthew signaled for the group to pause. He wanted to search for any official trail markers or footprints. He found none. Zoe leaned against a tall boulder and wiped sweat from her forehead. She asked if anyone else felt an unusual chill in the air. Ella nodded. A sudden snarl broke the silence. They all froze, scanning the thick undergrowth. Zoe gripped Ella's arm. Matthew tightened his hold on the knife. The snarl did not repeat, but a faint rustling suggested that something was moving near them. Richard motioned for them to continue carefully, hoping to avoid provoking any creature. The group advanced another 100 yards, slipping between mossy stones, but their nerves were raw. When they finally slowed, Zoe looked around and realized the trees seemed to press closer, as if they were in a corridor of dense growth. She told Matthew that she could sense eyes on them, but he said nothing. He only nodded, stepping over a tangle of roots. Richard tried to reassure everyone by saying the beast, whatever it was, might just be territorial. Ella whispered that they should keep their voices down. They did not want to attract attention. By late afternoon, they had failed to find any sign of the cave or the river. Their water supply was running low and tempers flared again. Zoe scolded Richard for his stubbornness, saying he had led them into danger. Richard paced, breathing heavily, clenching and unclenching his fists. Matthew's expression darkened. He reminded Richard that they found strange prints, unsettling fur and claw marks. Richard stared at the ground, unable to form a convincing defense. They chose a spot to camp before nightfall, hoping to gather enough firewood to last until morning. Zoe insisted on building the biggest fire they could manage. She said they had to keep predators at a distance. Ella helped gather branches, though her hands shook. Darkness came early under the thick canopy. The group huddled around the flames, each of them absorbing the grim possibility that something large and dangerous was roaming this part of the forest. They exchanged worried glances as the fire crackled. None of them knew how close the threat truly was. They broke camp early, with Zoe urging everyone to stay quiet while they packed. The previous night had been miserable. All 4 travelers heard faint snarls and snapping branches in the distance. They took turns stoking the fire and glancing at the tree line, but nothing had attacked them. By dawn, their nerves were frayed. Richard led them southwest, or so he claimed. Zoe questioned whether he was guessing. He raised a hand to silence her. Matthew and Ella walked behind them, scanning every ridge for signs of movement. The dense forest undergrowth tore at their clothes. Sweating and exhausted, they pressed on for what felt like miles. Suddenly they heard a rapid pounding of footsteps nearby. A large, wolf-like shape emerged from the bushes. Its eyes appeared locked on them. Zoe felt her heart hammer in her chest. Matthew muttered that they should back away slowly. Nobody moved for several seconds. The creature stared, emitting a deep, guttural sound. Ella inhaled sharply. She whispered that it seemed bigger than a normal wolf. Richard tried to step forward and shout, but the beast snarled and bolted toward them with startling speed. Matthew lunged sideways, shouting for the others to run. Zoe and Ella turned and sprinted into the thick vegetation. Richard tried to follow, but he tripped on a twisted root, lost his balance, and vanished behind a cluster of branches. Matthew stood between the creature and his fleeing friends. He raised his knife, trembling but determined. The beast charged. Its body slammed into Matthew, driving him into the undergrowth. Zoe heard his shouts and the piercing cries echo through the forest. Ella clutched Zoe's arm, and they kept running, branches scratching their faces and arms. Their lungs burned, but they did not dare slow down. After several minutes of desperate flight, they realized Richard was no longer with them. Zoe gasped that he must have fallen behind. Ella listened for any sound of pursuit, but heard only the pounding of her own heartbeat. She grabbed Zoe's hand and pointed toward a cluster of dense bushes. where they could duck and catch their breath. Both women collapsed to the ground, panting and trying not to cry. Zoe asked Ella if she thought Matthew was still alive. Ella's voice wavered. She replied that she hoped he had escaped, but the creature's strength seemed overwhelming. They sat in strained silence, blinking away sweat. Zoe wondered aloud if Richard had been caught too. Ella closed her eyes and said they needed to keep moving. She spoke in a shaky tone, reminding Zoe that the forest was large, and they were unarmed. Zoe held up her empty hands and felt helpless. They crawled out of their hiding spot and inched forward. Broken branches littered the area, and the dirt showed signs of violent struggle. Zoe swallowed hard. She refused to speak about what might have happened to Matthew. Ella motioned for Zoe to follow her deeper into the woods. They stepped slowly, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The midday sun filtered through the branches, casting dull patches of light. Zoe's pulse was still racing. Ella stumbled over a fallen log, scraping her knee. Zoe helped her up, and the two exchanged nervous looks. Neither knew where they were heading. They only wanted to distance themselves from the place of the attack. Time blurred. Eventually they stopped by an old oak tree covered in moss. Zoe allowed herself a moment to breathe. She wiped grime from her face, then examined Ella's injured knee. It bled lightly, so Zoe tied a piece of cloth around it. Ella thanked her, her voice subdued. She glanced around, wondering if the beast was still hunting them. They decided to continue south, guided only by a vague sense of the sun's position. Their progress was slow. They tripped on roots, tore their clothing on thorns, and began to feel weak from thirst. Zoe asked if Ella had any water left. Ella checked her pack and discovered just a small amount. They split it, their throats burning for more. A sudden rustling made them freeze. They pressed themselves against a fallen trunk. Moments passed, and nothing emerged. Both women exhaled in relief. They trudged on until they found another cluster of boulders, where they decided to pause. Zoe tried not to think about what they had lost. Ella stared at the dirt, wiping silent tears. Soon, dusk arrived again, bringing a chill. They had no tent or large supply of food. They built a small fire from fallen branches, though their fear of attracting attention was strong. Zoe stood watch, listening to the forest. Her mind spun with images of the terrifying creature, Matthew's final shout, and Richard's absence. She gripped a charred stick for reassurance, feeling the weight of an unimaginable horror that they could not outrun. Matthew lay sprawled on damp soil, his limbs trembling from shock. The large creature stood over him, glaring at him with an intensity beyond normal comprehension. It was not a wolf, though its muzzle resembled one, and it was not a bear, though its size and power were overwhelming. The beast appeared to toy with him, circling him slowly. Matthew's breath came in shallow bursts. Warm blood dripped from a ragged wound on his thigh, where sharp teeth had torn flesh. He tried to crawl backward, but pain flared through his leg, sending spasms up his spine. The creature emitted a guttural noise that suggested it was in no hurry to end his suffering. Matthew forced himself to remain conscious, gripping his knife with trembling fingers. The forest around them felt oppressively silent, as though every living thing had withdrawn in terror. He recalled that Ella and Zoe had fled moments before. He prayed they had reached safety, but he doubted there was any real refuge in these woods. The beast lunged forward, striking Matthew's shoulder with claws that tore through fabric and skin. He gasped, clutching the hilt of his knife. His only thought was survival, no matter how unlikely it seemed. He mustered the last of his strength and jabbed upward, driving the blade into the creature's hide. A wet snarl broke the quiet. The beast pulled back for a moment, as if surprised that its prey had fought back. Matthew tried to stand, but his leg gave out and he collapsed onto the moist ground. The smell of blood and sweat filled his nostrils. The creature advanced again, raking Matthew's chest with savage force. He screamed, his vision blurring as agony coursed through him. Yet the beast still did not deliver a final blow. It paced around him, letting him bleed. Matthew's eyes welled with desperate tears. He felt cold, and his head throbbed. He coughed and tried to call out for help. His voice cracked. He mustered everything he had left, screaming Richard's name. He knew Richard had not died in the initial attack. Matthew had glimpsed him stumbling through the undergrowth. He hoped that Richard might return with some wild burst of courage, or at least distract the beast for an instant. The only reply was silence, broken by the creature's ragged breathing. Nearby, concealed behind a broad trunk, Richard crouched with his back pressed against rough bark. His heart pounded in his chest. He heard Matthew's pleas, but he could not force himself to act. His arm shook. He closed his eyes and imagined the animal's teeth turning on him next. He was too terrified to move or speak. He rationalized that if he stayed hidden, perhaps the creature would eventually wander away, leaving him alive. Matthew realized that rescue would not come. A wave of furious resentment filled him, then dissolved into raw anguish. He coughed again, spitting blood onto the leaves. He clutched the knife, though his strength was rapidly fading. The beast circled closer and swiped at his forearm, opening fresh wounds. Blood stained the soil beneath him. His vision flickered. He aimed one last desperate thrust of the knife, catching the creature in the foreleg. The impact was weak, but enough to make the beast recoil briefly. Then it rushed forward, knocking the knife from Matthew's grip. He felt the brutal jaws clamp around his shoulder and release, leaving him with fresh agony. He cried out in pure torment. The creature paused, letting out a deep snort as though it savored the moment. Matthew's vision dimmed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and he suspected he had only minutes left. He whispered Richard's name again, though it emerged more like a faint rasp. He heard no response. Richard stayed frozen, tears running down his face, hearing the horrifying sounds of Matthew's final struggle. Branches snapped and Matthew's screams turned into whimpers. Then all was quiet. Richard's eyes stared at the ground. He felt guilt, but terror kept him from moving. For several minutes he could not bring himself to look around the trunk. When he finally did, he saw only trampled undergrowth and a dark trail of blood leading away. His friend was gone, and the creature was nowhere in sight. Richard sank onto the ground, burying his face in his hands. Thoughts of escape and self-preservation battled with remorse. His mind raced, but his body felt paralyzed. He forced himself to stand, fighting the urge to collapse, trembling with pain and dread. Ella and Zoe sat among twisted tree roots, attempting to steady their breathing. The forest around them appeared unchanged, as though nothing significant had happened. Yet they knew Matthew had faced a grim fate. Their minds reeled with the possibility that he and Richard might be gone, leaving them isolated. Finally, the forest fell unnaturally silent. After several long minutes, Ella murmured that they should return to the place of the attack. Zoe's voice quivered as she asked if that was wise. Ella reasoned that they needed to confirm whether Matthew or Richard survived. They stood, knees shaking, and moved cautiously through dense growth. Broken branches and scattered leaves marked their frantic flight from earlier. They proceeded slowly, eyes scanning every shadow. No one spoke. The eerie quiet pressed down on them. At last, they noticed patches of flattened underbrush and spatters of dried blood on the ground. The metallic smell made Ella recoil. She covered her mouth, hoping not to retch. A short distance away, they found Matthew's body. It was twisted and mutilated, lying near a fallen log. Zoe turned away in horror. Ella sank to her knees, tears gathering in her eyes. They saw deep gashes across his chest and arms, and his clothes were soaked with blood. His face was contorted with pain, and one hand was still outstretched, as if trying to hold on to something. Ella forced herself to look away. Zoe pressed her fists to her temples, fighting a surge of nausea and panic. They knelt by Matthew's remains, struggling to comprehend that he was gone. Ella shook her head, whispering that she had never imagined something like this. Zoe exhaled unsteadily, wiping tears from her cheeks. She realized they had to salvage anything useful from Matthew's pack, because they were unprepared for another day of running. Ella found a small bottle of water and some trail mix. Zoe retrieved Matthew's hunting knife, still stained with blood. Her lips trembled, but she slipped the knife into her belt. She also discovered a spare flashlight in his side pocket, though its batteries were weak. She twisted it on and off, confirming it still worked, then shoved it into her pack. They stood up, searching for any trace of Richard. The area was thick with briars and broken branches. Ella called his name once softly. Zoe grabbed her shoulder and shook her head, reminding her that they risked attracting the murderous beast. Ella nodded, swallowing hard. There was no sign of Richard, no blood trail that might indicate where he had gone. The realization that they were alone sank in fully. Zoe rechecked the pockets of Matthew's torn jacket for clues, but found nothing to help them locate Richard. She swallowed her fear and told Ella they had to leave immediately before the creature returned. Ella looked at Matthew's ruined form one last time, tears running down her face. They had no means to bury him, nor the time to attempt it. They turned away, stepping carefully around the blood-soaked ground. Their thoughts swirled with grief and terror. Neither spoke for many minutes. Twigs snapped beneath their boots, reminding them that any noise could bring the beast. Finally, Zoe said they must find the river. She recalled Richard's earlier claims that a ranger station existed near the water. Ella nodded, her voice nearly gone. They chose a direction that seemed to slope downward, hoping it would lead them toward a stream or creek. The forest felt oppressive, each branch resembling a claw that sought to trap them. Ella clung to Zoe's arm whenever her legs threatened to buckle. Zoe focused on each step, scanning the terrain and listening for any unusual rustle. She gripped the knife's handle, determined not to be taken by surprise. Time crawled, and the sun's position shifted, though the canopy blocked most direct light. They paused infrequently, sipping from the small water bottle and sharing a piece of trail mix. Every shadow seemed alive. They wanted to call out for Richard, but the memory of Matthew's demise and the presence of an unknown predator kept them silent. By late afternoon, they decided to stop near a stretch of dense undergrowth. Zoe suggested resting to gather strength. Ella agreed, though her expression was dazed. Both of them remained on alert, flinching at any snap of a twig. As they prepared to continue, they both thought of Matthew's final moments, feeling numb and frightened. They realized they could rely only on each other for better or worse. Zoe pressed forward, guiding Ella through thick clusters of ferns and tangled vines. The sunlight above them was fading behind tall cypress and pine. Each step felt harder than the last. Their bodies ached, and every rustle made their hearts pound. They knew the beast might still be lurking. After an hour of trudging downhill, they reached a patch of muddy ground speckled with animal tracks. Some were deer, but others appeared bigger and unidentifiable. Ella held her breath, fearing they belonged to the same predator that had killed Matthew. Zoe gripped her knife with one hand and pulled Ella along with the other. They continued toward what they assumed was south, relying on instinct and the faint slope of the landscape. The air smelled stale, and mosquitoes harassed them, leaving itchy welts. They grew more exhausted with each passing minute. Zoe kept her eyes on the ground, searching for any sign of running water, but all they saw were twisting roots and damp leaves. Unexpectedly, a chilling snarl echoed through the trees. Ella froze, and Zoe pulled her behind a thick cluster of broad-leafed bushes. They crouched, hearts pounding. Leaves quivered around them. For a moment, they heard something moving through the foliage, accompanied by a low, menacing growl. Zoe braced herself, knife ready. Ella's eyes brimmed with silent dread. The sound drew closer, then paused. The minutes stretched, suffocating them in tension. Finally, the unseen creature moved away, snapping branches as it departed. They waited several more minutes before daring to stand. Ella whispered that perhaps the beast had caught another scent. Zoe nodded, though her face was taut with anxiety. She believed the predator was playing with them, stalking them as if savoring the chase. She urged Ella to keep moving. They began a half-jog, half-walk, pushing aside branches that scratched their arms. Their flight lasted until they heard their own ragged breathing echo in their ears. Eventually, the forest floor dipped, and a faint trickle of water became audible. Zoe gestured for Ella to follow the sound. Relief sparked in their eyes, but that relief was short-lived. A sudden snap of twigs behind them made them whirl around. They caught a brief glimpse of a dark shape weaving between trees. Zoe seized Ella's wrist and pulled her toward the stream, hoping moving water might confuse the creature's sense of smell. They stumbled over logs and splashed into the shallow water, soaking their boots. The bank was slick with mud, slowing their pace. They heard the predators panting somewhere in the distance. Ella clenched Zoe's shoulder, whispering that they should keep going. They clambered up the opposite bank, hearts hammering. The menacing presence seemed to drift in and out of earshot. Fear drove them onward until they spotted a rocky outcropping ahead. Its base had a small opening, more like a hollow in the stone than a true cave. Zoe saw an opportunity for shelter. She guided Ella toward that opening, their feet slipping on damp rocks. Inside, they found a shallow grotto, barely tall enough for them to sit upright. The interior smelled of wet limestone and old leaves. They crawled in, panting. Night was fast approaching. They had no better option. The beast's growls had faded, but they suspected it was still near. Zoe used the flashlight from Matthew's pack to inspect the cramped space. Aside from debris, it appeared empty. They tucked themselves against the back wall, exhausted beyond words. Ella's hands trembled, and Zoe wrapped her own arms around herself in a futile attempt to stop shaking. Outside, darkness settled, bringing a sudden drop in temperature. Their clothes were damp, and chills began to take hold. They tried to rest, but every gust of wind made them think the beast had returned. Sometime after midnight, a muffled snort reached them. They listened, holding their breath. A faint scraping of claws against stone suggested the predator was investigating the area. Zoe gripped the knife, glancing at Ella, who clenched her jaw to avoid making a sound. The creature shuffled around outside, letting out low grunts and intermittent growls as if sniffing for them. Minutes crawled by, feeling like hours. Then the sounds receded, and the night fell silent again. They remained awake, hearts pounding, afraid to stir. The grotto offered minimal safety, but leaving in darkness felt suicidal. Zoe's mind raced, searching for a way to reach the ranger station without leading that monster right to them. Ella clutched her arm, tears streaking her dirty cheeks. They knew morning would bring another confrontation, but they hoped the few hours of rest would give them a chance to survive the chase one more day. A pale gray light crept into the grotto, revealing the exhaustion etched onto Zoe and Ella's faces. They had spent the night huddled together, listening for every sound. When dawn finally arrived, they felt only a faint flicker of relief. Outside, the forest remained hostile and silent. Zoe shifted her weight, numb from hours of cramped sitting. Ella winced as she tried to stretch her stiff limbs. Their clothes were damp and clung to their skin. Zoe decided they had to move before the beast returned. She examined Matthew's knife, then found a sturdy, broken branch near the grotto's entrance. She lashed the blade to the branch with a strip of cloth from her shirt, creating a makeshift spear. Ella watched with confusion. Her voice trembled, asking Zoe what she intended to do. Zoe explained that they needed a diversion. Running endlessly had proven futile. If they tried to outrun the creature again, one or both of them would likely die. She told Ella to hold the makeshift spear and be ready. Ella accepted it reluctantly, her eyes reflecting apprehension. She did not fully grasp the plan, but she had no alternative. Zoe glanced at the morning sky, trying to gauge their direction. She stepped out of the grotto, motioning for Ella to follow. They had covered only a short distance when they heard a rustling of leaves behind a cluster of trees. A chill rippled through them. They realized the beast was near again. Zoe whispered for Ella to hide behind a thick trunk and keep the spear raised. The undergrowth parted and the creature emerged, baring its teeth. It moved more confidently than before, as if it recognized their scents. Its eyes flicked between the women. Zoe's stomach clenched, but she shouted at Ella to wait for her signal. She then sprinted forward, hoping the monster would chase her. The creature snarled and bounded after Zoe, leaving Ella momentarily unchallenged. Zoe sprinted toward a faint roar that she assumed was the river. Branches tore at her arms and her lungs burned. She concentrated on the pounding of her own heartbeat. She knew her action bordered on recklessness, but she needed to buy Ella a chance to strike. The beast crashed through the foliage, closing the distance with alarming speed. Its panting grew louder. After a few frantic seconds, Zoe glanced over her shoulder. The creature had paused, scanning the area. A low rumble left its throat, as though it sensed a second target. Realizing Ella was still behind them, Zoe shouted at the top of her lungs. The beast ignored her attempts to lure it away and pivoted, heading back toward Ella's hiding spot. Zoe cursed under her breath. She had wanted the monster entirely focused on her, but it seemed driven to eliminate any threat behind it. Ella gripped the spear tightly, her knuckles white. She saw the beast rushing toward her and froze with terror. At the last possible instant, she thrust the spear forward. The improvised weapon jammed into the creature's open jaws, slicing flesh and sending dark blood across the branch. The beast staggered, letting out a furious roar. Ella stumbled backward, stunned by her own success. Yet the creature recovered quickly despite the deep wound. It lunged, knocking Ella off her feet and tearing at her with claws. She screamed, her voice echoing across the trees. Zoe skidded to a stop, hearing the horrifying sounds of that struggle. She realized the plan was falling apart. Ella's spear had only delayed the inevitable. The beast's jaws clamped down on Ella's shoulder, and her screams cut short. Desperate, she struck at its flank with her bare hands, but her strength ebbed. The creature twisted its head, delivering a fatal blow. Zoe listened to Ella's final cries, knowing she had intentionally put Ella in that position. Survival had become the only priority, and she had gambled on Ella's life to gain a chance of escape. Trembling, Zoe turned away, forcing herself not to look. Guilt tangled with relief. She sprinted toward the growing rumble of rushing water. The beast's snarls and Ella's last breath echoed behind her, pushing her legs to move faster. She burst out of the trees and reached a muddy riverbank. The water churned around rocks, forming small whitecaps. Zoe stumbled along the river's edge, ignoring the sting of scratches and bruises. She glanced over her shoulder and did not see the creature. She suspected it was still near Ella's body or possibly stalking her anew. She could not stop. Fear fueled her. She slid downhill along the bank, searching for a path that might lead to safety. Zoe trudged along the river's edge, her body weak and her senses dulled by shock. The sun climbed higher, exposing every cut and bruise on her skin. Mud clung to her clothes, and dried blood streaked her arms. She focused on the rushing water, trying to keep panic at bay. She heard no growl behind her, but dread hung over her like a warning. Despite her exhaustion, she forced one step after another, hoping the river would eventually lead her to civilization. Time blurred. She stumbled over rocks and slipped in the silt, nearly falling face first into the current. She caught herself, gripped the damp bank, and kept going. Somewhere beyond a bend, voices rang out. Zoe froze, uncertain if they were real. She squinted and spotted a group of hikers along a narrow footpath. Their brightly colored jackets seemed impossibly normal in this nightmare setting. They waved when they saw her. Zoe tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She managed a single plea for help before collapsing onto her knees, eyes rolling back as darkness overtook her. She awoke in a hospital bed, tubes running from her arms and monitors beeping steadily. Bandages covered her left forearm and part of her shoulder. She felt disoriented, vaguely recalling paramedics lifting her onto a stretcher. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a nurse stepped in to check her vitals. Zoe asked where she was. The nurse explained that hikers had found her near the river and contacted rescue services. She was in a facility outside Lafayette, being treated for dehydration, blood loss, and multiple lacerations. Days seemed to pass in a fog of medication and exhaustion. She remembered a detective entering her room, asking questions about the woods, her friends, and a possible animal attack. She provided only minimal details, describing a massive creature that killed her companions. The detective appeared skeptical, but promised to investigate. Zoe felt too drained to argue. One morning, a soft knock sounded at her door. Another patient had woken in the next room, the nurse said. That patient was found near the same river, severely injured. Zoe's throat went dry. She demanded to know his name. The nurse hesitated, then explained the man's injuries were extensive. He was unconscious, with broken ribs, deep lacerations, and internal trauma. The nurse mentioned that someone identified him as Richard. Zoe's pulse pounded. She had assumed Richard was dead or missing forever. Knowing he still lived shook her. That evening, she mustered the strength to leave her bed after the staff changed shifts. She disconnected a few monitors, wincing at the pain in her limbs. Quietly, she slipped out of her room and found the corridor dimly lit. She followed a sign indicating the intensive care rooms. The nurse's station was empty, and only the distant echo of footsteps suggested any staff nearby. She checked a small board on the wall, scanning patient names. At last, she found Richard's room number and approached. The door stood partially open, revealing darkness inside. She entered carefully. Machines beeped softly around a single bed, where Richard lay motionless. His face was bruised, an oxygen tube running beneath his nose. Gauze bandages covered his left side, and a cast enclosed his right arm. His eyes were closed, his hair matted against the pillow. Pale overhead lights cast a stark glow on his injured frame. Zoe inhaled unsteadily, stepping closer. She noticed the bruises around his neck and the stitched gashes across his shoulder. The displays showed erratic vitals, but stable enough to keep him alive for now. She studied his features, recalling how he had abandoned Matthew and vanished into the forest. She thought of Ella's death, her final screams echoing in Zoe's mind. She reached for a pillow resting on a chair beside the bed. Her fingers curled around its edges, her knuckles turning white. She stared at Richard, her thoughts a storm of betrayal, fury, and sorrow. His eyelids fluttered, though he did not wake. She felt her heart thudding against her ribs. The memory of the terror in the forest pulsed through her veins. Seconds passed. Zoe raised the pillow slightly, gazing down at Richard's battered face. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor filled the silent room. She could not erase what had happened in those dark woods. Nothing would restore Matthew or Ella. Her rage and her need for closure battled inside her. Slowly, she lifted the pillow higher, her expression unreadable.